The purpose of this video is to give a summary of an improvement that you can make to some of your original Jersey Jack Pinball I/O boards to increase the capacitance of the 70-volt power supply, which is used for the flippers and in most games things like the pop bumpers, magnets, kickouts, things of that sort. So what we have here is a summary of some of the different board generations. So on the left here, we're showing the original I/O board. This actually came out of a dialed in. We're showing one of the Woz I/O boards, and then we're showing one of the new boards that was used in Toy Story, Godfather, Elton John, and I presume in all future games going forward. So really the big part to notice here is the difference in the size of the capacitors of C701 and 702. You can see in the original board for both Woz and older games, again, like I said, this was from my dialed in, but it's the same for all older games. They used 3300 microfarad capacitors here, same with Woz. And then you can see on the new board, they increased it to 6800 microfarads. So they basically doubled the capacitance of these two capacitors. And basically what that's going to do is allow much more power to be available for the solenoid. So like I said, anything on the 70-volt power supply is going to be improved by this update in the capacitance. So a couple other things to note, some other changes on the new board. You can see that they had to shift these bridge rectifiers up and move the capacitors up more than when they were, or where they were in the original design, and that's due to the fact that these larger capacitors have a much larger footprint. So as we're going to show later on, it's not possible to just install these new capacitors in the old spots where the old capacitors were, because they won't fit. If you try to do it, it would interfere with the bridge rectifier as well as with the fuses. One of the other changes that they made on the board is you can see that they changed these resistors. So on both, again on my dialed in and on Woz, you can see that these are through-hole resistors, and they changed them to surface mount resistors on the new board. So in addition to doing that, they actually increased the resistance between the older board and the new design. So that had a couple improvements, one of which is the higher resistance means there's less power dissipation in the resistors, so they don't get as hot. And the second improvement is by having these resistors mounted right on the board, there's better heat dissipation versus having them floating in air. So one of the good news, or one of the pieces of good news I should say, is that these resistors are only used for the LED indicators for the different power supplies. So even if they do fail on the older boards, it's not really going to affect any gameplay. The only thing it would do is basically render those LEDs useless in terms of indicating if like the fuses were good or things like that, but it would not affect gameplay. Some of the other interesting things to note is the difference in circuitry between, again, so this is Woz and this is the original board, again from dialed in, is the additional components populated here. So Woz was unique in the fact that it has a crystal ball, which is a little LCD display that can show some images. That's connected here, and then there's another USB port which was used for the original lighting system on Woz. So when they say that the new board is not compatible with Woz, that's why, because you can see on the new board they're not populating these components. So right now, really the only option for a game like Woz is to do a swap of the capacitors. So I think that's a pretty good overview of the different board generations and the capacitor change, and the next thing I'm going to show is really the workflow to upgrade your device. So if you have these two boards here, I'm showing the FlipMods kit, which contains everything you need to do this upgrade yourself. Obviously it's possible if you wanted to make some sort of different standoff or things of that sort, you could do this on your own, but the kit is pretty convenient because it includes everything you need to do it. So that includes the capacitors, a standoff, some double-side tape to help fix the capacitor standoff to the board, the extended leads, some alcohol swabs to help clean the board before you apply the tape, and then some eyelets, which I'll get into later in the video, to help make sure that you have a good connection on the board for the leads. And then really this is just showing the end result. So again, this is on my dialed in. You can see the larger capacitors here. You can see the standoff that sits up above the bridge rectifier in the back and gives you clearance for the fuses. So in the next part of the video, we'll go through all of the steps, including how you remove the old capacitors, how you install these eyelets that we're showing here, how you solder the new capacitors in, and some details on that whole install process. I'm using the Hako 301 solder remover. In order to use it, you basically have to put the tip of the remover on the lead, wait for it to melt the solder around it, and then you pull the trigger on it, which turns the vacuum on, which sucks up all of the solder within the joint. So there you can see I'm doing it for the first lead. Now I'm going to do it on the second lead. I'm going to go to the second capacitor, do the first lead. And then the second lead of the second capacitor. You can see that's now removed all of the solder on the leads. I'm going to show using the Hako solder remover again on a board here. Unlike what I showed previously, I'm not quite as zoomed in, but I wanted to give you an overview of what the actual technique is for removing the capacitors once you get all of the solder sucked out with the solder remover. So you'll see the first capacitor worked pretty well. If you can see what I'm working on right now, one of the leads is actually bent over, and this is the concern with some of these what they call snap capacitors, is that with these leads bent, if you're not really careful when you remove it, you can damage the through-hole plating within the board. So I'm actually adding a little more solder here to help melt the entire area so that I can get a little more suction going to remove all of the solder within it. Now I'm going to move on to the fourth one. Okay, so now that that's done, what I need to work on now is trying to actually get the capacitors off the board. So I'm picking up the board and slowly working to bend that lead straight up so that it doesn't damage the through hole when I pull it through. So I straighten the first lead out. I'm going to do the same thing on the second lead. Alright, so now I have them straightened. Just making sure it's totally straight so that I don't damage that through hole as I pull it through. Okay, so now you can see the caps here are very loose. You can almost get the first one out without having to reheat anything, but just out of an abundance of caution, I'm going to very, very gently wiggle it back and forth and apply some heat while pulling the lead up. So I put the solder extractor on that first lead, pull it, now I'm going to go on the second and basically just wiggle it back and forth until it comes out. You do not want to pull with any force. You want it to be basically coming out without having to add any additional force to it. So I'm going to do the thing with the second capacitor here. I'm heating it, pulling. I'm going to heat the other side, and then very gently I'm wiggling the capacitor back on the other side of the board, which you can't quite see. It's very loose now, it's about to come out. And there it is. Several people have been asking what the purpose of the eyelets are for, and to help answer that, I think this diagram will be useful. So what you're seeing here is a visual representation of what the circuit board looks like with the capacitor. Obviously there's a resistor here, but
imagine that that's a capacitor for the purpose of this discussion. So the orange area that you're seeing is representative of the traces on the top of the board, and the vertical component of that is actually what's called the through-hole plating, which then goes to a pad on the bottom of the board. And the idea is that those traces actually conduct electricity through that through hole to the bottom of the board, which is where the components are soldered. So what can happen with those snap lead capacitors is that in the installation process at the factory, those leads can sometimes scrape through part of that plating, and then when we remove the capacitors, that can also scrape the plating, and the end result is it's possible that that interior through hole may not conduct electricity due to the coating being scraped off. So what the eyelet does is it basically bridges that entire gap within the through hole so that you're guaranteed a good conduction material between the top of the board and the bottom of the board. And as far as whether or not this is absolutely required or not, I think a lot depends on your ability to desolder these leads safely, such that those leads aren't scraping the interior of that through hole. But we are recommending the installation of the eyelets just for the absolute maximum reliability for the install. And in the following parts of the video, we'll demonstrate a few different techniques for soldering the eyelets in place. So now I'm going to demonstrate approach 1 for installing the eyelets. And this is probably the quickest method for doing it, but also there is probably the most risk for accidentally getting some solder to basically go within the eyelet, in which case you have to use the solder remover to remove it afterwards. So right now I'm just placing the eyelets in place, so there's 4 of them, just using tweezers here to get them in place. And so for this next step, it's very important that your soldering iron is clean of all solder before you place it in the eyelet, otherwise you're going to get some solder residue to stick within. So I'm using the soldering iron, putting the tip of it into the eyelet, and then very carefully soldering around the eyelet onto the copper trace, making sure not to get any solder in the eyelet itself, and instead just keeping it around the border. After I'm done doing that, I'm using a pair of tweezers to keep the eyelet in place while I pull the soldering iron out. First one looks good, now I'm going to go on to the second eyelet. Same approach, clean soldering iron tip, put it into the middle of the eyelet, and then press the solder against the board and the edge of the eyelet, again making sure not to get any solder into the eyelet or any solder touching the soldering iron directly. Again, using the tweezers to make sure that the eyelet stays in place when I pull the soldering iron out. So the difference with approach 2 is that the soldering iron never actually touches the inside of the eyelet. So for this approach, the soldering iron is always contacting the outer pad and then the edge of the eyelet, and then solder is applied in that connection point between them. So again, you have to be very careful not to actually get solder within the eyelet, but you only want to be touching it to the edges. So in this technique, I am slowly going around the edge of the eyelet, heating it up, and then applying solder around and watching it get wicked into the gap between the eyelet and the board itself. And this approach does take a little bit more time because it takes more effort to heat the entire circumference of the eyelet. So as I said, this approach is slightly longer than approach 1, but it is a little easier to make sure you don't add too much solder, since you can very easily see the inside of the eyelet to make sure that no solder is getting inside of it. So you can see I got a good ring of solder all the way around that eyelet. So for approach 3, the difference here is that solder is actually going to be applied around the pad before the eyelet is even installed. So this technique is probably the slowest out of the three of them, but it also has the least risk for getting additional solder in the eyelets, which, as we had stated earlier, would need to be cleaned out. So here I'm putting a bead of solder around the entire edge of that pad. You can see you don't want to get too much, because if you make this too deep, then once you install the eyelet, some solder could overflow into it. So I'm just adding a very minimal amount of solder. Now that that's done, I am inserting the eyelet, cleaning the solder tip again to make sure that there's no solder on it. Then I'm going to insert the soldering iron into the eyelet using tweezers to help guide it. Once that reflows, I will use the tweezers to make sure that the eyelet does not come out. So the next step after getting the eyelets installed is to clean off the top of the board. So I'm using some Flux remover, which I had just ordered off of Amazon. So it comes in this convenient pen. And you don't need very much of it. You just need a little bit. I'm going to dab it onto the area where I've been soldering, so all four of those pads. And then after that, I'm going to clean it off with a Q-tip and then use a pad to help get the rest of the residue off. So there I'm just wiping off whatever residue was freed up by the Flux remover. So I'm going to clean off the board with alcohol. If you are using the FlipMods kit, it comes with two alcohol pads, one to use for the top and then one that we can use for the bottom of the board. So it's pretty simple. Just open up the pad and you're going to clean the two pads for the first capacitor, then clean the two pads for the next capacitor. And after that's done, you just want to let it dry. And this will help make sure that there's a good contact surface for the tape that's included with the capacitor. So as part of the capacitor install, it's very important to make sure the orientation of the capacitors is correct. So take a look at this diagram and ensure that all the capacitors have the negative side lined up as shown.
So now I'm going to work on installing the new capacitors, and here's what it's going to look like. So here you can see it's a 6800 microfarad cap, and the old one was a 3300 microfarad cap. So I was also working with FlipMods to make a mount for this. So as you can see here, the actual capacitor is this piece here. Then it's held to this mount with some very strong double stick tape. And then after that, you can actually see that there's some markings on here for the negative side of the capacitor, which obviously lines up with the negative side here, and then a mark here in red for the positive side. So this really helps to make sure that you're not going to mix up the polarity when mounting it to the board. Then below, there's some double-side sticky tape that will be removed here, which will then help make sure that it does not vibrate when it is attached to the board. So now I'm going to peel off the tape here. Just got it there. And I should note that obviously these leads are soldered down into the back of the capacitor, which is then contained within the mount here. So I got that unpeeled, so now the tape is ready to adhere, and now I'm going to match obviously the plus side here with the plus side on the board. I'm going to put it through. It's down. I'm going to push on it to help make sure that it makes good contact. So the other thing to notice is that This mount is the exact same diameter of the mount of the old capacitor for the footprint, so that ensures that there are no clearance issues. As you can see down here, there's a surface mount LED that indicates the power status, and we want to make sure that that's not going to be bumped into or accidentally covered by the mount. So there's plenty of room there. Like I said, it matches the exact footprint of the existing capacitor. I should say the old capacitor. Okay, so now I'm going to install the other capacitor right here. So do the same thing. Going to peel off. Peel off the tape. Again, making sure the positive side matches the positive side of the board. I'm going to push on it. And then that makes a really, really tight fit here. Okay, so then the next step is going to be to solder that on the back. So now I've flipped the board over, and as you can see, it's actually very convenient. With that tape on there, you don't actually have to worry about these caps coming loose while flipping the board over to solder it. I'm again just wanting to make sure that it is as tight as possible on here before soldering it. And now I will work on adding solder to it. So this lead here is actually on the ground, and you can see it's taking a little longer for the solder to actually melt, and that's due to the ground plane conducting a lot of that heat away. So just have to be patient and wait and make sure that it gets hot enough. Let that cool a little bit. Now I'm going to do the other cap. Okay, now that they're soldered, just double checking everything looks good. I'll trim the leads on it. I'm going to use the Flux remover pen. Just put a dab of that on each of the traces. I'm going to clean that off. Then I'm going to put some isopropyl alcohol on it and just really make sure everything there is clean. And that's all there is to it. So now this board is ready to go.